This is Generous Theology. What is the modern fascination with the great American novel? How does it relate to secular ideas of establishing a canon of humanistic scripture?
Yeah, certainly the question becomes, in part, is there one great American novel, or is the great American novel a genre? If we go with the latter, I think there may be a sense that as we walk through, if you do like an American literature or history of the American novel course, you are going to see, I think, as you walk through from beginning to end, progression away from the earlier writings of even people like Melville and Hawthorne to some of the things that come later. And one of the ones that was on your list was Freedom. I have not read Freedom by Jonathan Franzen, but I've read a couple of his other novels, and certainly Franzen, as I understand it, and what I have read of him, it's a very different perspective than what you would have read if you were reading Hawthorne or Melville or those like that. So there is a sense in which I think you're going to see a progression. But I think that there's also probably one of the things that's uniquely American is that, at least in comparison with Europe, we in America have retained some kind of a veneer of religiosity, and we could have probably have a nice discussion about what that really religiosity really is. Is it really Christian or is it something else? We're talking about this the day after the Super Bowl, which I often refer to as the high holy days of the American civil religion. So maybe our religiosity is more about the American civil religion than it is about Christianity. But I do think that you would see in a list of great American novels as a genre, I think you're going to see some level of variety. And so something more modern, like To Kill a Mockingbird, I think there are themes in To Kill a Mockingbird that are consistent with Christian worldview. You're probably not going to take a novel like To Kill a Mockingbird as the be all and end all of what it means to have a Christian worldview. But there is, at least in a character like Atticus Finch and in how he handles the events in his community and how he goes about things, there is a underlying understanding of a particular Christian worldview there. And in some other, I think you can get that in even some newer novels, not super new, but another writer who I don't think he's a Christian in any way. John Irving has written a number of novels that I've really enjoyed. He's also written a number of novels that I've really hated. But there is a sense in like a book like A Prayer for Owen Meany, which I don't know whether that's ever been nominated as a great American novel, but got to be at least up there. You will see, I think, in A Prayer for Owen Meany, you again see sort of this interesting sense of religiosity. It may not be the same as Christianity, but there is this sort of syncretism of Christianity and civil religion. And that comes out in the way certain characters talk about faith and religion in a way that I don't think you see in the 20th century or even in the late 19th century in a lot of Western European writers. Now, the question then becomes, what does that say? Does the fact that we have this veneer of religiosity, is that really Christian? And is there maybe even something even more dangerous about sort of assumptions being made that because we have this veneer of Christianity, or at least this veneer of religiosity, that somehow we're okay, we're still a Christian nation, we've got these values, and we're good to go. And when really what's happening is something much different from that. But I think that is a really worthwhile consideration to think about as we think about some of these novels.
Yeah, I think I'm inclined to, if we can place the quest for the great American novel inside of any one camp or any one group, and not saying that we have to, because like you point out, the genre is quite large. But I would actually maybe think that the people who I hear talking about this great American novel seem to be in the quote unquote intellectual traditions associated with the secular thinking that came over from the continent. And so here I'm thinking of the French Revolution, I'm thinking of the modernistic existentialism of the Continentals and how it developed out of the idealism of the previous century, which itself developed out of Christian ideas, as we've talked about before in our survey of the Cambridge history of 19th century philosophy. I think of the age of passion and this secularizing idea of the passionate man. Goethe, many other literary influences from the European continent and how they've affected people over novelists in America. I want to read just this brief quote from Napoleon Bonaparte. And the scene is one day he's come to a battle scene and he sees the dead troops that are there. And he finds, besides one of them, there is a dog beside the body of his dead master. And he's licking his master's face and he's howling mournfully. And Napoleon was very haunted by that. And he wrote, "This soldier, I realized, must have had friends at home and in his regiment. Yet he lay there, deserted by all, except his dog. I looked on, unmoved, at battles which decided the future of nations. Tearless, I had given orders which brought death to thousands. Yet here I was stirred, profoundly stirred to tears. And by what? By the grief of one dog." And I want to point out that this brief snippet from Napoleon has some of the same elements that I see people referencing in candidates for the great American novel. This idea of the pathos of the human condition, this idea of looking at the horror one has become, or looking at the horror that other people have become, and seeing one's place in it existentially, which I think of that the Doors famous song, Riders in the Storm. Like a dog without a bone, we are thrown into this world. And so you have this pathos. And so novels that tend to have similar forms of pathos around situations, tragedies, for example, are great candidates for these great American novels. So, for example, Moby Dick. What do you have in this story? You have a man who has fallen into some sort of dysphoric mania, this lust to destroy this whale, and how it has consumed the man to the point where it consumes him and leaves him without anything. So had he been able to resist the allure of this obsession, perhaps he would have had a quieter and even a beautiful life. But as it was, the tragedy of this all consuming desire has, in some sense, destroyed him. What a great picture of the modern condition. Now, we see in another candidate, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, we see man's inhumanity to man. And we see that in the context of the issue of slavery and how this one book so changed the culture. And I think that's one of the prerequisites for what people are thinking about with a great American novel. Uncle Tom's Cabin changed not only the literary landscape, but changed sort of the cultural landscape around the issue of slavery and really helped set a course of the country in the early 19th century. And so you have that sort of situation. Similarly, with the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, doesn't, of course, the Civil War's over at this point, but that doesn't mean the underlying issues aren't present and that there's not something for the writer to point out. Now, in that light, what I wish to note is, where are the Christian great American novels? Again, it could be that Christians just have not written with talent in this genre and in this vogue. I'm not so sure. Like I said, the one item that does come to my mind right away is Lew Wallace's story, Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. I would put that up against any other candidate. And yet, if you look at list after list, there's an exclusion here. And if there are religious portrayals, they tend to be negative or pejorative in the way that that Enlightenment thinkers have thought of. Christianity is this atavistic remnant. This Christianity represents a childhood that we moderns have grown out of. Christianity represents an old way of thinking that we have matured into a new way of thinking. Christianity tends to be portrayed as extremely prudish around issues of passion and pleasure, sexual relationships. And so if you are going to integrate that aspect of your being into your life, then I think the typical modern take is you'll want to avoid Christianity because of its puritanical prudishness. Let's say it that way. So I think we're getting a picture here of cultures in conflict. And with that in mind, where would you take that, Chuck? And also, are there maybe some other examples of readings you have done that have really profoundly affected you one way or the other?
Yeah, as I think a little bit about some of the characteristics that would make up a great American novel, there is a sense in which I think there still are Christian themes that come out in some of them. And so, yes, there is often in a novel, you've got a conflict, and that conflict is often internal, but it can be external as well. I think internal conflict has become often more popular as part of the theme of at least literature as opposed to less literary fiction as it's presented. But I think there is a sense in which you still see in a lot of American novels this clash of good and evil. And that clash of good and evil, while we're not going to draw our theology out of the way that it's such a thing is drawn out in an American novel, I think we do still see some reflections in some novels of the old Puritan idea of the world being really about a clash between righteousness and evil and a clash between those two things. And for example, and I know that there are in Moby Dick, there are multiple interpretations of what Melville's trying to get at here. And some of them lean more towards the idea that Melville actually was a Christian writer of some sort. Others take interpretations that say, no, he was not particularly friendly to Christianity, or at least to Orthodox Christianity. So I know there's some differences in that regard, but there is a sense in which there are interpretations of Moby Dick as being about this pursuit, this monomaniacal pursuit of this whale as being an image for God, but that what you have is this captain who has gone crazy because he's pursuing God, but not pursuing him in a way a Christian would pursue him, but pursuing him to try to kill him, to get rid of him. And I know, I wish I could remember. I know that when I had to read Moby Dick in a college class that I took, and as I recall, the professor was telling us about that Melville actually had some correspondence, I'm thinking, with Nathaniel Hawthorne, and at least one of his contemporaries as a writer, and that he was concerned with what have I written here? What is it that I'm talking about? And as I recall, he even thought that the book, in some ways, he was concerned that the book itself was evil because of the way that people might interpret that. But there is a real sense of a good versus evil, and I think that's something that we do see, and I think that is a reflection of our Christian culture, even if the books themselves are not. And then this idea of a hero, often a hero who is sacrificial, and that can happen in many different ways. So you have Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. He doesn't necessarily give up his life in some heroic death that, but he does. He is still a hero because he is willing to take on what he sees as evil in the community, take on a righteous cause, no matter how the rest of his community views him as a result. And so I think we do see some themes like that come out. And it's interesting too, because I think one of the things that we can do as Christians is we can read novels and look for themes like that are common, perhaps even from authors who aren't necessarily Christians. And we can, in looking at these images and looking at these themes, point out that there are some very common themes in our world that people are searching for. They're trying to understand evil and good. They're trying to understand, what does it mean to be a hero? What does it mean to be willing to sacrifice oneself for somebody else? What does it mean to be an upright hero, an upright person in the midst of an evil world? Well, those are themes that I think as Christians we understand and we can take on, and we can even use that to point to the fact that there is this God-shaped hole in the hearts of many. Now, to go beyond that, I think there are still some authors today, or maybe not today, and I'm not specifically speaking as writers who are alive today, but 20th century writers at least, who have in their writing have some level of a Christian worldview, or at least a positive view of faith and Christianity. I don't know whether any of her books would qualify as great American novels. She wrote a lot more short stories than novels, but Flannery O'Connor is one of my favorite authors. And she often, too, she writes from, I think it's a primarily Roman Catholic perspective, but she brings Christian themes into a lot of and I think there are some others as well. Some of the older, I think in the 19th century, you have, what was her name? She wrote Death Comes to the Archbishop and My Antonia. Willa Cather is another 19th century author who I think brings Christian themes into some of her works. Another one is Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison, I don't know much about her faith, but I've read a number of her books as well, and you do get a sense of the how much of African American culture has been soaked in a Christian tradition, in some of her writing as well. And then another one that another more modern writer who I think is definitely is a Christian. And while we may not agree with every one of her theological views necessarily, but Marilynne Robinson she's written a series of novels that I think really come. She writes in a way that really reflects Christian ways of thinking as well. And Gilead is I think her most famous book, and it really gets at sort of the difference between a very sturdy but sometimes unbending character, or one of the older characters in the book, and then how they related to their son who's broke away from the faith, and then there's this reconciliation, and that theme of reconciliation, and as part of reconciliation, people giving up of themselves in the way that Christ did. That theme seems to come out in a lot of her writing as well. So as I think about, I think you've got your concerns that a lot of times people are looking for a great American novel that really gets away from Christian ways of thinking. And I think there's some truth to that. But I still think that it is worthwhile pursuing great literature, and worthwhile reading great literature, and worthwhile considering the themes in great literature, because I think we still find, even in it's really about common grace, right? Even in the writings of people who are absolutely not Christians, we find some of these themes, and we can discuss them and get into them in ways that as Christians we can either use to draw why we believe the way that we do, or we can use to draw that these themes are common in the world, and that the answer to some of these questions that get raised in literature can only really be found in our faith. Yeah, I'm perhaps a little less disenchanted with the idea of a great American novel, perhaps, but I also accept that we do have to be careful about how we do that. And good reading of literature always means that we're reading with our brains engaged to what is actually happening in the writing, and what are the themes, and what are the worldviews that are being expressed in that writing. So I think that's a worthwhile thing to think about.
Yeah, and I think I very much enjoyed, of all of the classes that I did enjoy in high school and in university, I think the literature classes were my favorite. I did enjoy reading about so many different types of literature, so many different types of conflicts, so many different archetypal story types, let's say. You mentioned earlier the hero's quest, the hero's journey. We talked about man's inhumanity to himself, and also these clashes of cultures. Where I think I'm really lacking in all of the candidates is I think I'm lacking in a recognition of man versus God and God versus man. So I'll throw out one of the short stories. Obviously, not a great American novel, but one of the short stories I remember reading about was Man versus Nature. And so this was a story, Leiningen versus the ants. And it was just this really fascinating tale of a plantation owner, I believe in South America, who was battling to save his plantation and the people in it from this deadly plague of destructive ants that would not only eat all of the vegetation and just leave behind a barren wasteland, but would also kill all of the animals and kill all of the people as well. And so that was a very ingenious thing. I remember seeing that, but really such an atheistic tone in novel after novel. No even thought given to actions that, hey, I'm responsible. I'm responsible for my actions before a holy God. Hey, I have to answer for what I do, for what I think. Or even, hey, the other characters in this story have to answer to God. And in that sense, a very, very anti authoritarian tendency in most of these candidates. Where I wanted to go with this great American novel concept is I wanted to go to this idea that you and I talked about Zygmunt Bauman's book, Liquid Modernity, recently. And Bauman's idea that in his vision for what modernity can be, that would include no allegiance to any particular principles or concepts, except for short periods of time, let's say for a utilitarian purpose. And so, with that in mind, I actually get the sense, if I can put on my Freud hat and psychoanalyze my great American novel secularist friends, I almost see the search for the great American novel as roughly corresponding to a post biblical search for canon. There's this expression of desire to have these canonical sources for life, for understanding them. The great literature of the moderns is meant in some way to ultimately replace the great literature of the Holy Scriptures. And again, you've challenged and pushed back on that to some degree. And I think it's an arguable point, but it's a very interesting thing to me how, in the midst of all the possible ways great American novelists can frame issues and the resolutions that they can move toward, it's just an amazing thing how none of them finds God, how they rarely, if ever, come to this understanding of this divinely ordered, this order coming from chaos, this ultimately driven by purpose, by a personal being that has an authority over them, the writer, and them, the people in the novel. Instead, we tend to see so much more of rebellions against authority, so much of removing restrictions. As a matter of fact, that might be, I think, one of the most important emphases in the candidates is this idea that do what thou will shall be the whole of the commandments. So that's, of course, a famous phrase uttered by 19th century occultist Aleister Crowley. And that contrasts, of course, with the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt, thou shalt live under an authority. That is the authority of God and his commandments. And that's where I see that whole movement going, is we see the tension in modernistic and postmodernistic thought, even as the movement wishes to reject concepts of authority and even canonical concepts. At the very same time, they want to coalesce, at least to some utilitarian degree, around these canonical ideas in literature. And rather than resolving in terms of people relating to God, what I noticed in these great American novel candidates is it's about resolving a pathos, having this catharsis. Something happens, tension builds throughout the novel. The protagonist and the antagonists are interacting with each other, And then at the end of the novel, there's some cathartic answer that may only be local in scope, but it may be global in scope. And it's interesting how I think people, in the absence of having an authority figure and a canonical set of literature that they can turn to, will then go and try to make up their own, or try to bring in their own. And I think about that now with modern and postmodern thinkers. One example you and I've talked about is, I think about Jordan. He's an author who's largely certainly rejected traditional categories of Christianity, although he seems very slippery on some new and modern ideas of Christianity. But here it is. He seems representative of a scene that has rejected canon, and yet he writes a book, 12 Rules for Living, and then comes out with another 12 rules as a sequel. And I'm not saying anything pejorative about Peterson, but in the absence of actual commandments from God, it's amazing how people still desire to be governed by principles that are good and honorable and virtuous. But who can find them outside of a grounding in godliness? So that's, to me, the quandary and the tension of the search for the great American novel, which I would comfortably fit inside of the larger critical tradition. Where can you go with that, Chuck, or build on that? How does some of this, what does it make you think of?